Hi, this is Liz Moyer, the REDCap team lead at OHSU, and this video is part of our Tips and Tricks series. And in this video, we'll be talking about importing data into a REDCap project. So specifically, we'll be looking at the data import tool. We'll talk about the REDCap skills and experience that you'll need to be successful using the import tool. We'll talk about some requirements and rules that aren't documented in the software itself for using the import tool. We'll briefly mention some best practices, and then we'll do some demonstrations. So the data import tool is a project application that you can use to create new records or update or add data to existing records. For users who want to import data, they'll need the user right to the data import tool. If you want them to create records, data, they'll need create records rights, and they'll also need data view and edit rights on all the forms that you want to allow folks to import data into. Let's jump over into the software, start looking at the import tool, and start looking at a project. So I'm clicking on my project here that I've got set up for our demo. And I can see over here in my left-hand navigation menu that I am a user with access to the data import tool. It's listed over here in the application subsection. Let's click on my user rights and just double check the rest of my user rights. So I again have access to the data import tool. I also have the ability to create records. I also have view and edit rights on all the forms. So I can import data into any of these forms and I can create new records. Next, let's look at how this project is set up. You'll need to understand how the project is set up so you can understand how to transform and get your import file set up for importing data. If you don't have access to this tab, you'll need to ask these questions to the project builder and get some information from them. First thing you need to understand is this project got longitudinal data collection set up? If it does, you need to understand how longitudinal data collection or how data that's collected in longitudinal projects is stored, is what I meant to say. And then if longitudinal data collection is set up, you'll need to understand the setup for your project. So you want to understand what the events are because you're going to need these auto-generated unique event names. When you are prepping your import file, and then you're going to need to understand what forms have been assigned to what events. Moving back to our project setup tab, you'll also need to understand how your project is managing the record ID. So in this project, auto numbering for the unique record ID has been disabled. So this project is using its own IDs. And then I also want to understand if repeatable instruments and events has been enabled. That's going to affect what the import file looks like, and if I want to import into a form that's got it's set up to be repeatable or events that's set up to be repeatable, I want to understand how to do that. Last thing is you want to understand some of the attributes of the fields that you're importing into, and you'll get that by looking at the codebook or downloading the data dictionary. Let's jump into the codebook. Special things you'll want to pay attention to is what is the variable name of the record ID field, and that will be the very first field on the very first form. So here we've called that study ID. You'll also want to understand if any validation rules have been applied to fields. So I can see zip code, phone, email. I've got some fields with validation rules. You'll want to know the raw values of any radio buttons, drop downs, yes, no fields, check boxes, true, false fields. You can also see that there are raw values associated with that form status field that REDCap applies to each one of the forms that you create. You want to understand if there are calculated fields and what fields are involved in the equation, so you can trigger that calculation at import. You also want to understand if branching logic's been assigned to a field because you want to import data in such a way that it conforms to the conditions of the branching logic. Now let's look at the data import tool itself. We'll look at the documentation here on the page, and then we'll talk about some of that rules and requirements that aren't listed here in the page documentation. So For our training, we're going to be doing a CSV import, so that's comma separated value, and we'll be looking at our import files in Excel. So most folks use Excel when they're managing a comma separated value file. You can see there is an advanced option to do a CDISC or an XML import. We won't be doing demonstrations for CDISC or XML imports for our class, or sorry, for our training. Let's download our data import template with rows. You can see down here that REDCap by default wants to import in rows. Some other default settings is REDCap wants us to import our dates as month, day, year with a 4-digit year or year, month, day. REDCap's going to ignore blank values in our import file. And again, we're doing a comma separated value formatted import file. So let's go look at the template that we downloaded. And then let's go talk through the template, talk through some additional requirements. So the first column of our import template is always reserved for the unique record ID. Again, in this project, we called that study ID. If we have a longitudinal setup, we can see that the next column will be for the event name for which we are importing data. And then the rest of the columns will correspond to each one of our fields, and they are grouped together by form in order of forms in the Online Designer. So the first form was our contact form. So all these fields are fields that exist on our contact info form. And then the last field on our contact info form will relate to the form status. Now, if we were prepping this file for an import, we would need to understand some of the rules and our rules for importing and some of the requirements that are going to get enforced. And we'd also want to think about some best practices. So let's jump back over to our slide deck. When you're importing data, you're actually doing data entry. So data entry rules apply. Let me just walk through those real quick. Validation rules will be enforced. The lock state of any form or any records will be enforced. As it said on the documentation for the data import tool, blank values will be ignored. It will also ignore any calculated values, but if you import the value for the fields involved in the equation, importing will trigger the calculated field to get executed. Form status behavior is enforced. If you remember, the way form status behavior works during data entry is the first time you enter data in a form, if you don't go manually select a form status, REDCap will save the form status as incomplete. And then if you have a survey project and you're using automated survey invitations, because importing data is like doing data entry, importing data will trigger REDCap to evaluate the logic in those invitations, which means importing data could trigger scheduling or canceling in survey invitations. Be prepared to transform any data that you have gotten from an external system or that you have accumulated somewhere else and you're trying to get it ready to import into REDCap. You need to import raw values for radio buttons, drop downs, or checkboxes. You also need to prepare, if you have a longitudinal project and you're importing data into forms set up to different events, or you're importing into repeating forms or events, you need to have a long format import file. And then some best practices. If you're going to be importing into your project when it's in production, test importing during development. It's important that you understand how the import tool works, and it's important that you understand the work you'll need to do also to transform files for importing. Additionally, we recommend that you import in batches that correspond to discrete forms or events. This makes the import file easier to build and to manage and to ensure the data quality as you're transforming data to get imported into REDCap. But this also ensures that you don't run into a performance issue. You want to consider the total number of data points in your project. You know, many projects end up with thousands of records across thousands of data points. And if you're importing data in the middle of the day when there tends to be the most activity in REDCap, the most users doing the most things, we highly recommend that you import 500 or fewer records with 500 or fewer variables per record, just to ensure that you don't run into an issue where you might get timed out during the import. So let's go look at an import file I've already prepped for import, walk through it a little bit, and then we'll import it to see how the tool works. Okay, so here's a file I've already prepped beforehand to import some new records into our project. We've got some IDs that we've created in our first column. We've got the event name enrollment because we're going to import onto fields that exist on 3 forms that are assigned to our enrollment event. So I'm going to import into the contact form. I'm going to import, looks like, into the demographics form. I'm just looking at the I'm looking at this complete. Underscore complete is always form status, so I know a form is ended right there. And I'm going to import into my labs form. And let's go import this file. So that's the file we were just looking at. Click import, and I'm going to click upload. First thing I'm going to look at is, are there any errors or warnings that prevent me from moving forward? So there are some warnings. You know, REDCap wants a 4-digit year. Excel often takes your dates and transforms them into a 2-digit year. And REDCap is saying, hey, I'm assuming you meant this particular 4-digit year, and I did. Now it's saying, hey, here's some notes. Black equals new data. Gray means existing data. Things won't change. Red means you're going to overwrite some data. So I want to review the data I'm importing. Again, also, we recommend the best practice of importing, you know, into discrete forms and events so you can better review the data you're importing. So there's the data I'm importing. You know, you can see the transformation to a 4-digit year. Do I want to import this data? Yes, I do. And it's a new record also. You can see here, new record, black, new data. REDCap's telling me 10 records were created or modified. Let's just go double check and look at the record status dashboard. Let's open one. You can see I've got 10 records, data entered in these 3 forms. Let's just do a double check. Buffy Summers is IM 101, 101, Buffy Summers. Okay, things are looking good. So let's see what happens when you try to import a file that's got some errors that might prevent you from moving forward. Let me grab a file I've got prepped already. Let me upload this file and see what happens. So I've got a red box now with some errors, and it's saying, hey, you got to fix these things before we can try to import this file. So you get the record ID, and you get the field that the error is related to, the value it's trying to import, and then a message. So my zip code doesn't meet the 5 or 9-digit US zip code. Female is not a valid category for gender, and 210.1 not a valid format for the PLT file field. So what I need to figure out is, what are the valid categories for gender and what is the validation rule that's been applied to PLT. Let's go check our code book. I'm just going to do a browser find gender. So here's the raw value. Again, I'm supposed to import raw values for dropdown. So I need 2 for female. And let's search for PLT. And that's platelet count, and that's been validated to be an integer, so it can't have a decimal point in it. So let's pull up that file and fix those things. Not that file, this file. So with IM111, here is my bad zip code. So let's fix that. 70000. With IM112, here's my bad gender, needs to be a raw value, and that was 2 for female, what we saw in the code book. And then IM113 had a number with a decimal point for platelet count, and what I need to do is remove that decimal point. Great. Let's go try to import this now that we've fixed those errors. I've got my warnings again about the year, but I've also got a new warning, and that is saying, look, I'm trying to import a value into age. Age is a calculated field, so REDCap's just going to ignore this and not import 41 for age. Again, it's going to transfer my 2-digit into a 4-digit year or transform that. Review this key like we did before. Look at my import file. Again, a bunch of new records with a bunch of new data. Good with me. Let's import that. Let's go back and look at our record status dashboard. Now we've got all these new records, and I did import. I did import date enrolled and birth date, which were the values that were involved in the age calculation. So let's go see if the import triggered the age calculation. Let's just look at Homer over here in demographics, and it did calculate the age. Let's look at the one we tried to import and see if the age got calculated correctly. Got an age here. So I think I had tried to import 39, which wasn't correct, and it triggered the calculation here and came up with the sum of 39, which is correct. Next thing we want to do is just look at this blank value or show you proof of concept that blank values get ignored, and then also show you how to use the option to overwrite saved values with the blank value. Let's go look at the file we've got going for that. So I've already prepped this file. It's a bunch of existing, you can see here I have a bunch of study IDs that already exist. And first name and last name, those are values I've already imported. And so I want the default behavior to happen where REDCap ignores these blank values, but I do want to import this value for the field with the variable name repo, which is save data to a repository. One, I believe, equals yes. So let's go import this data. So we're adding data to existing records. So again, gray text is existing data and it won't change. So REDCap's doing what it's supposed to do, ignoring the blank values for first and last name. And then I've got a new value, right? Black text equals new data for repo. And this is going to happen on existing records. So let's import that data. Let's go look at a record just to see if that happened. We were setting the value of yes to save to data repository. To say that was a mistake, and actually we didn't mean to set all the records like we did here to yes, save data to the repository. And so we actually want to have a blank value for repo, and we want to have it overwrite that value we just uploaded, all those yeses. So let's do some transformations to this file to prep it to do that. So I'm going to delete these columns. And then I'm going to clear out the contents here. Going to save it. Call it blank values overwrite. Now I'm going to jump back over to REDCap. And I am going to come down here. I clicked on my import to all link, and over here I'm going to change the default behavior, and I'm going to say yes, blank values in the file will override existing values. Now this is a big deal. So REDCap is going to ask me, are you really sure you want to do this? You know, you are going to overwrite data and blank it out, basically cancel it out with a blank value, and I do. But it's a big deal, so REDCap's wanting to make sure. I think that's good. A little word of caution. Let's go grab that file I just created, open it up, upload that file, And before we just click submit, import the data, let's review what's going to happen. So again, existing records, the data is attached to the enrollment arm. But what it's telling me here, one in red, that data is going to be overwritten with whatever is above this, which is a blank value. And that's going to happen for all the records. So all the records had a value of 1. Let's go import. Let's just go check some random records, and we're expecting that saved to repository has been overwritten with the blank value. So reset. Let's click another just random record. And one more. Really, the way to check this would have been to create a report, but in the interest of time, just to make sure there was no data getting returned, we're not going to create a report right now. Now let's move on and talk about importing into a form assigned to more than one event. And we want to import on that form more than once. So let me go to our import files I've prepped and do my import for longitudinal. So at the beginning of training, I was saying if you have a longitudinal project and you want to understand how REDCap stores data for longitudinal projects, which is multiple rows for each time point, for each record that data has been saved on that form. That's called a long format. That's how it's going to get exported in a long format, that kind of data, longitudinal data, and it needs to get imported in a long format. So in the file I've prepped here to import data for, I believe I'm importing data here for labs, lipids, and a visit, which is assigned to my different visits, visit 1, visit 2, visit 3, and 4, and I'm importing here for visit 1 and visit 2. So I have multiple rows for each one of my record IDs. And let's go to the import tool, choose that file, open it up, and upload it. Again, I'm getting the warning about transforming my year. And then you can see for record ID 101, for visit 1 and visit 2, I'm importing all the data that goes into my visit form, all the data that goes into my vitals form, all the data that goes into my lipids form. Same thing for record 102, 103, 104, etc. Again, these are forms that I am repeating at those discrete events I set up via longitudinal data collection setup. So let's come down here, import this data. Now let's go look at our record status dashboard, and we're expecting to see visit vitals and lipids completed at visit 1 and visit 2 across the board. And we are seeing that. If we click on a record, we see that. Okay, so now we're going to just jump into some more advanced demonstrations where we're going to do some, it just depends on how your project is set up if these will apply to you, but I'm going to jump into some different projects. We're going to do some auto numbering, and then I'm going to show you importing if you have data access groups set up. So I have a project here, let's go look at it, where if you scroll down and look at these optional modules, I've got 2 things set up that do some auto numbering. One, I'm using auto numbering for records, so that means that REDCap is auto generating the unique record ID. And I've also got repeatable instruments and events set up, so I've got my visit form set up as a repeatable event, and that means every time I create a new instance of that event to enter data in, then REDCap generates a number for that instance. Let's look at my record status dashboard. Yeah, so for here, record ID 1, there's one instance of the vitals, the visit being repeated. And then if I look over here at, record ID 6, let's click on here, 2 columns. So I've got 2 instances of the repeatable visit being completed. So first thing I want to do is just import some new records. Um, and because I have auto numbering turned on for the record ID, and you can imagine this, and you'd be at like with many more records. I don't want to have to always come back and check REDCap and be like, well, where did I leave off, or where did REDCap leave off in creating my records? In this instance, it left off with record ID 10. I don't want to have to remember that as I'm creating my new records. I want to create my new my new records in REDCap, create the record ID as I'm importing it, picking up where I left off. So the next record created would be 11, the next record created would be 12, etc. Let's look at my import file that I've prepped for this. So the record again, the first column is still reserved for the record ID, but you can see I just have whatever in the record ID column. So how do I transform whatever I have in this record ID column to a uniquely generated ID in REDCap? When I go to import this file, I'm going to come down here into my setting for the ID. When I have auto numbering turned on, REDCap still wants me to create the IDs by default. No, use the record name provided. Record name is actually record ID. So I'm going to change this to say rename all record names in the uploaded file. And this is going to force auto numbering. So let me go choose that file. Let me upload this. And it took those values that I had entered in my record ID column for each record, and it just went ahead and enforced auto numbering. So again, the next record will be 11, 12, etc. Let me import that data, saying, hey, here's the uploaded record name, and here's how I saved the record. So let's go look. Great, and I did that. Woohoo! Next thing I want to do is import some events. This again, or import into this repeatable visit event. So this is a repeatable event. It can be repeated on the fly, infinitely repeated for each participant. And every time I add a new event, so here, I get a new column. Add a new event, get a new column. So that's instance 1, instance 2. So let's go see at the form I've prepped for this. Sorry, the file I've prepped for this. So when I look at an import file, when repeatable forms and events are set up, I've got some additional columns in my import file. Not only, I've got the first column is for the record ID, the second column is for event if I have longitudinal, but then I have some additional columns. I've got the name of, or I'm sorry, I've got the repeat instance. So this would be like would be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. If I was looking at an export. And then if I was repeating a form, I would also have a column that would say redcap underscore repeat form. I'm repeating an event instead of a column. So in the old world of REDCap, I would have had to import this data. It would have to look something like this: 1, 2, 1, 2, and I would have to know how many of these instances how many visit events I had already created for each one of these records, which was very hard for folks to do, and I'll end up potentially overwriting data because these are infinitely repeatable. So REDCap has introduced the ability to put the keyword new in here, and for REDCap to look at how many instances have already been completed for each record, and then to auto enforce the instance a number when you import into a repeatable event or form. So let me show you how this works. So I've got the key term new in here. And when I go import this data, I'm going to choose my file. Let me just, sorry, before I do that. So it's all that I just explained. It's telling you right here in this tip about the repeat instance. Put new in there. So let me upload this file, transforming my date again. And I'm not repeating an instrument, I'm just repeating an instance. So I'm repeating, sorry, I'm not repeating an instrument, I'm repeating a whole event. This whole event, visit arm1, is getting repeated. And let's go see what happens with this new keyword. So it's saying, look, 20 records were created or modified during the import. Let's go look at our record status dashboard, and we can see many statuses. I've got multiple instances of my visit for each one of my records. And let's go click on one. So there was already one in there, and REDCap knew to name, or sorry, give the next instance the number 2, the next instance the number 3 for the repetition of the visit form. Let's look at something else. Again, 1 and 2. I only did 1 for this one. So that is using the key term new to have REDCap automatically associate the correct instance number with the data that you're importing into a repeating instrument or event. And then the last thing I want to show you is importing into a project with data access groups. So over here, I have a project with data access groups set up. Let's look over here. DAG stands for data access groups. I have 3 data access groups, California, Oregon, and Washington. I myself am not assigned to any of the data access groups. You can see there are no users in the groups, and that means I have access to all the data. If I was to create a record manually, I would decide, what group it was assigned to. That's because I have access to all the data access groups. So if I want to import, say, some new records and have those automatically assigned to those respective data access groups, I'll need to get the unique auto-generated data access group from here and include that in a column in my import file. So let's go look. So here, again, I have my import file. I'm coming up with the IDs. I'm going to come up with some IDs in this case. I'm going to just go turn off auto numbering. I've got my event name, but then I've got this extra column here with the data access group name. So let me jump back over here. Just disable auto numbering so it's consistent with how the file is prepped. Let me go over here to my data import tool. Let me choose the file. Bunch of new records. They're gonna, I'm importing some contact information into the contact form, which is assigned to the enrollment arm. And when I create these records, they're going to be assigned to these respective data access groups. Excellent. 15 new records were created. So let me just pull up California. Here's the records I created for California's data access group through my import. Here's what I created for Oregon through my data import. Here's what I created for Washington through my data import. All right, so that wraps up. Let me jump back over to my projects. Our tips and tricks video for importing into REDCap. Again, if you're going to be importing to the project, when it's in production, practice importing in development. If you've got some data that you got from an external system that you're going to practice with, also please make sure to de-identify it when you're practicing importing in development. If you have any questions, sign up for a drop-in and we can help talk about importing into your project. Thanks for watching our tips and tricks video.